All right, well, after a brief interlude in kind of social, economic, and intellectual history the other day, we're back to the nitty-gritty, the meat grinder of diplomatic history, which is, I know, why you're all here. Well, those of you who are IR majors anyway. We left a few kind of dangling participles moving into the 20th century, but without fully accounting for the background of what is usually called the Eastern question. Now, this is, of course, a Western perspective, the idea that the Ottoman Empire represents the East, thus it is, after all, east of Europe. So the Eastern question, of course, refers to this whole question of what will happen to the Ottoman Empire if and when it falls apart, as most European statesmen seem to assume it would. Now, of course, the Ottoman Empire had received something like a second lease on life, as we saw in the Crimean War, in part because Britain and France took the Ottoman side, because Russia's war effort bogged down, in part because of poor logistics, communications, etc. The Ottomans were more or less welcomed into the so-called Concert of Europe at a time, as I said, when, of course, the Concert of Europe was no longer really very significant. That is to say, it no longer meant as much as it did because there was no longer basic agreement on the key questions. The major diplomatic revolution of the Crimean War, as I emphasized, was the split between Austria and Russia, which, of course, opened up what we in English call a can of worms or a Pandora's box in the Balkans, because, of course, there the presumed decline of Ottoman power could lure in either the Austrians, themselves trying to shore up their southern defenses, or, of course, the Russians playing on pan-Slavic sentiments. It's, I think, sometimes exaggerated, this whole phenomenon of pan-Slavism. That is the notion that the Slavic peoples, like the Serbs and the Bulgars, the Macedonians, even by some reckoning, the Greeks could be included in this as Orthodox people, even if not necessarily Slavs. That is the notion that there was a kind of Russian purpose to protect and help out these peoples, whether it was earlier the Greeks, then the Serbs, then, of course, the Bulgars, as we will see in the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877. Well, so that was a factor in politics. But from the perspective of Europe, the whole problem was how to keep the peace. That is, how do you keep the great powers from going to war with one another whenever some kind of crisis happens in the Ottoman Empire? I already introduced you to Bismarck and some of his kind of bon mots, his sayings, regarding domestic politics, the idea that the questions of the day will not be decided by speeches and majority votes, but by blood and iron. He had some even more famous quotes about the Ottoman Empire. I think I also mentioned the one about Africa, where he pulls out a map of Europe and he says, "This is my map of Africa. Here is France, here is Germany, here is Russia. That is my map of Africa." Bismarck was rather cynical, you might say, about these things. Seeing Africa as not really worth anyone's bother, Africa was useful to him only insofar as he could keep the other powers embroiled there so that they would not team up against Germany. Now, the Eastern question was a bit more dangerous to Bismarck. He was even more emphatic. His view of the whole Eastern question is usually summed up the way it's often misquoted in English as saying that the entirety of the Balkans are not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. That is, a Prussian soldier. It's not worth the life of a single Prussian German soldier. Now, what he actually said, and this is in a speech before the Reichstag in December 1876, was that the entirety of the Ottoman Empire, or literally in German, den ganzen Orient, and Orient was shorthand essentially for Ottoman Turkey in the Middle East, was not worth the bones of a Prussian soldier. Now, Bismarck's contempt for the Ottoman Empire is sometimes exaggerated. What he really meant was he did not want Germany to go to war over it. He also didn't want the other powers to go to war over it. Now, the whole playing out of the Balkan crisis from roughly 1875 to 78 is worth examining in detail, not only because some of the even greater Bismarck quotes came out of it, but because it kind of prefigures in many respects the diplomatic crises right before and then during, of course, the First World War from 1908 to 1914. As Bismarck said in another one of his quotes, if war ever came to Europe, it would be over, quote, some damn fool thing in the Balkans. Now, I don't think he ever actually said this one. I think this is one of those apocryphal non-quotes. But what he meant was that some seemingly insignificant crisis would eventually draw the other powers in and lead all Europe to go to war with one another. Well, that very nearly happened in 1875-76. The thing which seemed to kind of set the crisis in motion was, I mentioned this before in the context of Egypt and why the British occupied Egypt. Same basic background. You have a financial meltdown. Now, not entirely unlike what happened in France before the revolution, only worse in some ways, because the Ottomans just outright defaulted. It was something like, again, paying quote-unquote 50 cents on the dollar. That is, they stopped paying their bondholders the full amount of what they owed, which of course led to kind of a run on Ottoman paper and what we usually refer to colloquially, even if not literally, as a bankruptcy. The Ottomans from this point on were never really fully sovereign, in part because they had to turn over control of their financial affairs to the Public Debt Administration, sometimes called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. The actual title of it was French, because most of the bondholders and most of the board members were French. It was called the Caisse de la Dette Ottomane. It actually had a very grand building in Eminönü, rather looking over the city of Istanbul, kind of glowering down on the city. Very much a symbol, that is, of European encroachment. So it wasn't just a matter of the capitulation, special legal privileges, separate post offices. That is, the European subjects were tried in their own consular courts. The Europeans, after the decree of Muharrem in 1881, literally collected most of the Ottoman Empire's revenues. Things like customs taxes, tolls, commodity taxes. All of the main revenues of the empire were now collected and administered by Europeans. You should keep that in mind when you evaluate the rule of the last of the true sultans, Abdul Hamid II. Because he certainly did his best to ward off the predations of the European powers. But he had a very weak hand. I mean, in some ways that actually makes his efforts even more impressive because the hand was so weak. That is, how can you really be sovereign of an empire that doesn't control its own finances? You try. You try your best. And he tried pretty darn hard, as we're going to see in a moment. Because, again, the Ottomans are now really facing crisis on all fronts. The financial bankruptcy maybe is kind of a symbol of weakness, a signal, that is, of weakness, which eventually leads to yet more of these kind of irredentist separatist movements, first in Bosnia, then in Bulgaria, where you have, again, a kind of, a combination of the whole phenomenon of first a kind of ethnic grievance or claim of oppression, then leading to various atrocities being committed, which of course then leads to publicity. I mean, the whole model, which was actually, it was almost perfected by the British liberal politician Gladstone. You should remember his name, because Gladstone was kind of the patron saint of the liberals in the 19th century. And Gladstone's whole view of things, there are some different theories about this as to why he was so weirdly pro-Russian and anti-Turkish, which turned out to be kind of the philosophy of the British liberals. Some of it, supposedly he had a Russian mistress, so I don't know if that had something to do with it. But basically what it came down to was this. The idea, this was true even in internal British politics, where Gladstone famously split the liberals apart by backing Irish home rule, that is kind of autonomy for the Irish. You might call it, like we call it today, I mean the equivalent of kind of NGOs and democracy promotion. The idea that morality is supposed to govern foreign policy. An idea which was actually considered quite senseless and foolish by the Tories. His greatest rival, at least in this era, was Benjamin Disraeli, who was actually half Jewish, interestingly, but was a deeply conservative politician. The Tories, in part because their main concern was sort of the empire, particularly the routes to India, geopolitics and strategy and the grand big picture. They had always been friendlier to the Ottoman Empire. It's not that they were pro-Turkish per se, but they saw the Ottoman Empire as a useful bulwark against the Russians. The liberals were kind of throwing this out. You should remember this because Gladstone, with all of his liberal moralizing, is, of course, the leader who actually occupies Egypt in 1882, which sets off the scramble for Africa. During this crisis, though, Gladstone's not in power. Disraeli is the prime minister during this crisis, which is one of the reasons why Britain did not intervene as Gladstone would have liked sooner, that is, against the Ottomans. But not being in power sometimes is an advantage when what you really want to do is get on your high horse and give speeches. Or in this case, it was a pamphlet. Pamphlet published in kind of pseudo-book form called The Bulgarian Horrors. Gladstone perfected this whole kind of anti-Turkish rhetoric. He called the Turks, quote, the one great anti-human specimen of humanity. This is usually the time when my Turkish students all boo, 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 boo. He was very much, you could call him an opportunist, but he thought he was principled. He thought he was standing up for morality and human rights and all the rest of it. But anyway, so Gladstone, he's not in power. He's criticizing the government, that is, for, as usual as he sees it, taking the Ottoman side. Although Disraeli didn't really take the Ottoman side. It was more complicated than that. But anyway, they're denouncing, the brutalities of the Ottoman government, some of which, of course, were exaggerated. There are all these stories you keep hearing from the Balkans about, children being butchered and thrown in the air and caught on knives and all these ludicrous-seeming stories. I'm sure many, many atrocities were committed, but of course they were exaggerated. Probably atrocities were committed by both sides, etc., etc. But Europe, for the most part, the press, they take the anti-Ottoman side, led by Gladstone. They're denouncing brutalities. The powers get together and they meet, right in Constantinople itself to kind of dictate terms to the empire. Various discussions of things like Christian rights, equality that they say is still not really being pursued. Obviously, minority rights. They want to make sure that there's more autonomy for some of these Balkan Christian provinces, etc., etc. And they assume that because the Ottomans are now weak and bankrupt, that Abdul Hamid II, who has just ascended to the throne after, you probably know about the saga with, Abdulaziz, sort of slashing his wrists, but one wrist and then the other wrist. It's kind of improbable, isn't it? The way it supposedly happened. Killed himself, yeah, but supposedly slit both of his wrists, which is kind of tough. Like once you do one, then how do you do the other? It's sort of tricky. But anyway, so Abdul Hamid, he's young, he's untested. The Europeans think they can probably push him around. But no, it's actually not literally him. I mean, it's the Grand Council convenes, and they say no. They say no. They refuse to accept these terms. And so here's where things get a little bit complicated. On the one hand, the Ottomans do say this: we will now have a constitution. Again, like the Tanzimat era, part of this is designed for public consumption. It's kind of to say to the Europeans, look, we can run our own affairs, thank you very much. We will now be a constitutional monarchy, somewhat like, let's say, England, and so you can no longer lecture us about how backwards we are, etc., etc. Actually, this is ironic because the Russians, who are the power who take up the kind of the cudgel of, the European crusade, they, of course, don't have a parliament either, whereas the Ottomans do. It's very interesting. But, so, they come up with a parliament. They actually go ahead and hold elections in the midst of this crisis where, the Europeans are sort of perturbed that the Ottomans are not accepting their terms. Things in the Balkans are still spiraling out of control. But meanwhile, the Russians have decided that now is their time, in a way, to avenge the Crimean War. As the Russians see it, though, of course, some of it is, again, you get this pan-Slavic propaganda emanating from Moscow and Petersburg. And in the way these things work, whether or not people really believe this stuff is probably less important than people thought people believed it. In other words, the government thought that suddenly the Russian people would become these pan-Slavists, who were desperate for Russia to stand up for the rights of the Slavic peoples of the Balkans. Like if you've read, probably you haven't, but if you have read Anna Karenina, Tolstoy. Has anyone read? Okay, so you know Anna Karenina. What does Vronsky do at the end of the novel? Do you remember? Like after she... Oh, I shouldn't give away. Spoiler alert. What happens to... I won't tell you. But anyway, his heart is broken, yada, yada. So what does he do? Well, he goes to fight in the Russo-Ottoman War, to go help out the Slavs. Partly because his life has no purpose and, he needs something new to do. So the Russians, they assemble a pretty big army. And, as they see it, they're standing up for Europe. They're sort of fighting Europe's, fight for them. Now, behind the scenes, though, not everyone is terribly happy about this. Remember, Bismarck is worried that some kind of war scare is going to plunge Europe into what will become like a world war. In fact, one aspect of the crisis that's not generally that well known is that this is the time when the Prussians, well, now Germany, but the Prussians were still running things, first initiated serious talk of the plans for what would become the two-front war against France and Russia, thinking that basically what the Germans are worried about now is that France and Russia are going to team up against them and they'll have to fight a two-front war, and so they have to figure out what to do in that case. So the Germans are already worried that that Russia might use this as an excuse to send its army, who knows, maybe against Austria, maybe against Germany. They're not sure what. Everyone's worried that what's going to happen? What are the Austrians going to do? In fact, oddly, Bismarck actually sent a delegate to London to try to talk to Disraeli, about how do we control this crisis. And one of his suggestions was, look, the Russians can invade Turkey, but only so long as the Austrians say it's okay. This is how cynical he was. He had no stake in the matter himself. But anyway, so the Russians finally do intervene. They more or less get the permission, kind of the other powers. But the other powers, again, it's not that they're happy about it. They just don't want to oppose Russia. The Austrians certainly don't want to fight a war, and the Austrians think maybe they can get something out of it. In fact, the Austrians basically cut a deal with the Russians so that they will eventually get Bosnia-Herzegovina, the territory you call Bosnia-Herzegovina. But anyway, you know the territory I'm talking about. The famous controversial territory that's going to figure in all these crises to come. In fact, they pretty much agree on this before Russia invades. Their idea is like, look, you can invade Turkey so long as we get Bosnia-Herzegovina. That's a good deal for Austria. As Bismarck later put it, when at the Congress of Berlin, when Austria demands Bosnia-Herzegovina after having not done anything. Anyway, Bismarck, this is my favorite Bismarck quote of all. He says, I'm going to write this word on the board so that you know what I'm talking about. I forget the Turkish word, but this is a bird. The pigeon. You know it? Güvercin. Okay, so we'll call it güvercin. So he says, and I quote, I have heard of people refusing to eat their güvercin unless it has already been shot and then roasted for them. But I have not heard of people who refuse to eat it until it has been shot, roasted for them, and shoved down their throat. That's what he meant about Austria demanding Bosnia-Herzegovina. That is after Russia has fought this war to weaken Turkey and carve up Ottoman Europe. But so anyway, the Russians fight the war. Right actually against the backdrop. I mean, they're mobilizing right as Turkey's holding these elections. It's all very dramatic. They actually had to wait, though, until April, basically, because it had to do with the Danube River, and the Danube River, basically flooding a little bit later than it normally did. It wasn't as easy as everyone thought. Everyone thought the Russians were going to be pretty easy. Famously, of course, the siege of Plevna. The Russians take, I guess, 6 months to finally, pierce through the Ottoman lines. But once this is basically their way through the Balkan range, the Balkanlar, the Balkan mountains. Once they're through the Balkans, the Ottomans are pretty much demoralized. Although it took them a while to make it through. The other thing that they do is that it's actually in December of 1877. The Ottomans are partly demoralized, but they also partly think the Russians are not going to bother sending an army through the Balkan mountains in winter. Now, what with the snows and all. But they actually did, and they actually surprised everyone. This was the one really, I think, great achievement of the Russian campaign was getting their whole army through the snows of the Balkan mountains, almost in the height of winter in December and January. So meanwhile, by February of 1878, the Russians have now materialized at San Stefano, Yeşilköy, as we call it today, which, as some of you may know, if you're from Istanbul, is roughly where the airport is. That's how close they were to the city. They're actually camped out at Yeşilköy. Now, that said, it seems like they're about to take the city. Military historians who've looked into the matter and they've seen the files show that the army was in no condition to fight by this point. They were exhausted from the campaign, suffering from dysentery and typhus and all the rest of it. They probably would not really have been able to march into the city. Although, interestingly, they nearly got the orders to do so. The Tsar actually issued orders that if the British Navy, if the British actually landed troops ashore in Constantinople, that is, in Istanbul, the Russian army would occupy the city, supposedly. The British, of course, never did land troops, so in the end that didn't happen. Britain, of course, has finally gotten its act together, and they send their navy to what we call the Dardanelles, what you call, I guess, basically Çanakkale. So the British have intervened somewhat belatedly, but essentially to kind of like lay down the law to the Russians, you will not enter Constantinople. It's a British threat. By that point, the Ottoman army was not in much of a great condition to fight. That said, as I said, the Russians weren't really in much of a condition to fight either, so it was a little bit like a kind of a phony controversy. Probably the Russians couldn't have kept fighting, but they pretended like they could, and they dictate peace terms. The so-called San Stefano Treaty, which led to the creation of this rather large Bulgarian puppet state of the Russians, which would have included much of Trachea. So anyway, the Russians dictate terms. But then, of course, the powers decide they don't like these terms. The Austrians don't like them. The British don't like them. The French aren't really paying that close attention, but they don't like them either. And so they get together for the famous Congress of Berlin, or as I like to call it, the Bismarck Show. Where Bismarck, because of Germany kind of has prestige now, because of unification. They're sort of like the great new power, and Bismarck is the greatest statesman. So everyone goes to Berlin to have the mastermind, Bismarck supposedly hash out a treaty. A couple good quotes from this conference, because I know you know that I love Bismarck quotes. This is, I already told you the one about the Gouvergy. The other one was, supposedly at some point during the conference, there was this dog yapping. And everyone kind of got a little distracted, and they tried to get the dog to shut up. And Bismarck said, "But you see, the dog does not know whom to bite. If he did, he would have bitten the Turks." Now, the idea being that the whole thing was kind of staged, obviously, at Turkey's expense. The powers get together and decide what parts of Turkey they're going to carve up. That's one way of looking at it. And certainly the Ottomans could not have been completely happy with the Treaty of Berlin, which resulted. However, Bismarck did hammer out certain compromises which were to the Ottoman advantage. The most important of which was, of course, breaking up the San Stefano, the big Bulgaria, into two parts, of which Eastern Rumeli, or Rumelia, was, again, reverted to the Ottoman Empire to formal Ottoman control. The Russians did gain Kars, Ardahan, and Batum, or as the Turks later referred to them longingly, Elviye Selassie. So these territories, these become almost like Turkey's version of Alsace-Lorraine, the area France lost to Prussia, the thing that they want back. The Russians, they also made gains in kind of the Danube Delta in Bessarabia, but these were probably more important. Now, interestingly, and this wasn't necessarily something the Turks themselves were involved in, but the other powers firmly denied Russia what it had tried to establish in the San Stefano Treaty, which was control of the straits, Çanakkale, which was really Russia's main interest and the thing they wanted the most, to be able to send warships into the straits. This was firmly denied them, and in fact, so angry were they that bizarrely, because it seems like Bismarck sounds like he's very anti-Turkish, the Russians don't see it that way. The Russians blame Bismarck for splitting up Bulgaria, which they thought was their greatest achievement. They blame him for denying, control of ships. And so that, interestingly, Bismarck is actually denounced for years by the Russian press as this, fanatic anti-Russian, which is significant because it leads to some kind of tensions between Germany and Russia. Meanwhile, of course, the seeds of potential future landmines have been laid. Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, confusingly, Austria, according to the terms of the Berlin Treaty, is kind of administering Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's a little bit like how the Ottomans supposedly still rule Egypt, even though the British are now ruling it. And even before then, Kavalala had been ruling it without orders. Austria is really basically administering Bosnia-Herzegovina, but according to international law, it's still part of the Ottoman Empire. So that you have these kind of potentially explosive landmines in the treaty. But meanwhile, keep this issue of straits and warships in mind, because this is a very important issue in the years before World War I. And as the Russians see it again, they felt like they had been used. They fought this war and they lost all these men, and then everything that they thought they had gained was kind of taken away from them by the powers. So that even though the war obviously doesn't go well for Turkey, it also kind of surprises people, because after all, the war's over and the Ottoman Empire is still there. I mean, remember, people have been saying for decades the Ottoman Empire is going to disappear, and yet it doesn't. It kind of just keeps keeps on trucking, as the Grateful Dead would have put it. Anyway, so the Ottoman Empire endures, even in this reduced state where the Europeans are running its finances. Abdul Hamid has somehow survived, and meanwhile, there's one gesture that Abdul Hamid actually kind of reserved for himself, which was kind of interesting. In February, just basically as the Russians are kind of sticking it to the Ottomans, he prorogues the parliament. That is, it's called proroguing. He dissolved the parliament. Now, this becomes a bit confusing in political terms. Like in 1908, during the time of the Young Turk Revolution, you heard a lot about, restoring the Constitution. But if you actually read the terms of the 1876 Constitution, of which Gladstone said, Turkish Constitution. Oh. Anyway, he didn't think the idea actually made sense. But if you read the actual terms of the Constitution of 1876, the Sultan had the right to dissolve Parliament, more or less indefinitely. And so according to Abdul Hamid, he had acted constitutionally. He just prorogued the Parliament, from 1878 until 1908. So for 30 years, the Constitution was active but suspended, you might say. And so the stage was set for Abdul Hamid's so-called despotism. And yes, he did have a secret police, and they did arrest opponents, and they had strict censorship and so on. But still, Abdul Hamid, again, he's not really an absolute ruler. I mean, a man who doesn't control his government's finances cannot really be classified that way. Meanwhile, back to the diplomatic chessboard. Now, Bismarck, as I have said many times, he was not only cynical. I mean, he had a kind of genius for these things. The thing that some of his successors in Germany didn't really understand was that sometimes diplomacy was a matter of doing two things at once which actually contradicted each other. You saw how at the Berlin Conference, as I said, Bismarck had kind of helped the Ottomans, denying Russia some of what Russia wanted. But as he saw it, of course, he was not really on anyone's side. Now, similarly, in the years to come, a couple of things happen. Quietly, even though Bismarck is supposedly, again, contemptuous of the Ottomans, seeing them as not worth the bones of a Prussian soldier, he does support the dispatch of a rather significant military mission to the Ottoman Empire. First led by General von Kahler, although it is usually more associated with his successor, von der Goltz, or von der Goltz Pasha, as he was later called, 1895. They begin modernizing the Ottoman army, and significantly, the Ottomans also begin importing rather large quantities of German weapons, particularly from Krupp, the famous armament firm. In fact, in 1885, German advisors and engineers were actually heavily engaged in revamping the Straits defenses, that is at Çanakkale, the shore batteries and so on. Putting German guns there, redesigning, showing the Turks where to put the guns, etc., etc. They're also helping to reorganize the Ottoman army, along more or less Prussian lines, dividing it up into European-style regiments and so on and so forth. So quietly, the Germans are actually helping to shore up the Ottoman Empire. In fact, in 1885, oddly enough, the threat, although there was a crisis involving Bulgaria in the same year, the threat to the Straits that they were concerned about actually came from Britain. And this is partly because of this great game scare that has to do with Afghanistan and Central Asia. The fear, though, was that if Britain and Russia went to war, Britain might actually force Çanakkale, that is from the Mediterranean direction, in order to attack Russia. And so the Germans are now thinking that they might want to support Turkey against any of the other powers, maybe Britain, maybe Russia. Possibly. On a very secret level, though, Bismarck is reassuring the Russians very, very quietly that if they decided to seize Çanakkale, the Straits, Bosporus, Boğaz, etc., the Germans would not object. I actually have the terms in front of me from the famous Reinsurance Treaty. You should at least write down the term because it was significant. Treaty of 1877, even 1887. Even though it only lasted 3 years, it was kind of the height, the essence, the apogee of Bismarckian diplomacy. Okay, the basic part of the treaty, which was itself secret, was that Germany and Russia were supposed to not go to war with one another. That is, in most circumstances. Everyone knew that France and Germany were basically hostile. Austria and Russia were basically hostile. So the idea was to keep, even though Germany and Austria were now allies, the idea was to keep Germany from going to war with Russia. So basically the Germans promised the Russians that they would not interfere unless Russia itself attacked Austria. That is, if Austria attacks Russia, Germany won't do anything. Wait a minute, did I have that backwards? That is, oh, no, right. If Russia attacks Austria, then Germany might help Austria. But if it's the other way around, that is, if Austria is the aggressor, then Germany will keep its hands free and will not bother Russia. Same thing goes with France. That is, if France attacks Germany, then Russia really has no cause for concern. Whereas if Germany attacks France, then Russia might consider coming to France's aid. There was a secret clause, an even more secret clause, which was a lot more significant. The Germans promised that they would stay neutral in case the Russian Tsar, quote, judged it necessary to dispatch a Russian fleet to protect the entrance to the Black Sea, that is the Bosporus, and thus safeguard Russia's interests. Okay, so on the one hand, Bismarck is helping to shore up the Ottoman Empire, revamp its defenses against the Russians. On the other hand, he's promising the Russians that if they decide to conquer the Ottoman Empire, he won't interfere. Even though there are German officers who are helping the Turks actually mount their Straits defenses. So, it's an interesting question, like which was the real Bismarck? Was he, well, he was obviously a bit cynical. What he knew, though, and this was kind of the essence of both his genius, but also one of the reasons why his successors were not able to keep this up, was that the basic goal for Germany was to keep France and Russia apart. So what happens instead? Well, this treaty, this sort of Byzantine reinsurance treaty, comes up for renewal basically annually, and for a couple of years they renew it. But then in 1890, the new Kaiser, that is Wilhelm II, basically he wanted to be like his own man. And he's like 30 years old. This guy Bismarck, he's already like in his 80s. And Bismarck, you imagine this. Like, okay, sure, he's the Kaiser, he's the emperor. But on the other hand, he's this little pipsqueak upstart. And Bismarck is like the great genius who's been around for decades. So the Kaiser doesn't like Bismarck telling him what to do. And so the Kaiser fires him. Now, there were domestic issues, too. Bismarck, as I mentioned the other day, had banned the Socialist Party in Germany. So the Kaiser, at least temporarily, he wanted to be nicer to the socialists. He later changed his mind about that because he thought they were all Jewish. But anyway, so the Kaiser sacks Bismarck in order to kind of put his new stamp on German foreign policy. And immediately the reinsurance treaty is allowed to lapse. That is, it dies. The Russians come to Berlin, they ask Germany to renew it, and the Germans say no. Just basically 4 years later, in 1894, although it actually happened from 1892 to 1894, discussions, the Franco-Russian alliance is sealed. So it really only took several years for all of Bismarck's handiwork to be undone just like that. France and Russia are now military allies with the alliance directed against Germany. Why? Basically because the Kaiser somewhat foolishly allowed the reinsurance treaty to lapse. The other thing the Kaiser had done very ostentatiously is he made a state visit to Constantinople, that is to Istanbul. This is way back in 1889. He made two major visits, one in 1889 and one in 1898. The first one, he was already Kaiser, but Bismarck was still around. And Bismarck actually told him not to go. It was like a deliberate act of insubordination. Because Bismarck, you remember, he's keeping these two balls in the air at once. He's trying to reassure the Turks that he'll sort of kind of help them, while also telling the Russians he's not really going to object. Well, the Kaiser basically goes to Istanbul, Constantinople, and he falls in love with the place. And Sultan Abdul Hamid, he takes him in, whispers sweet nothings in his ear, Your visit here will make the other European powers very nervous. And this guy, he's only 29 years old. He's very impressionable. So he thinks he's going to become the great champion and friend of the Ottoman Empire. That's the way the Kaiser sees himself. Now this takes on new life after his second visit in 1898, when the Kaiser, in a very grandiose vein, he doesn't just pay this very friendly visit to the capital and gives all these gifts like the Alman-Cheshmesi and all the rest of it. He then goes on to Jerusalem, and in the course of one visit, he makes all these promises to the Christians, a little bit like if you remember Napoleon III, Christians in the Holy Land. I will now protect all of the Protestants. I will protect the Catholics. I will protect the Orthodox. Then he meets with Theodor Herzl and promises to support Zionism. And then he goes to Damascus and he gives a speech at the tomb of Saladin. You call him Saladin, I believe. Right, the great medieval warrior against the Crusaders and so on. And he calls him a knight without fear of fault. And Yeah, at the Tum. And he gives this speech and he says, may the Ottoman Sultan and 300 million Muslims around the world realize that the Kaiser is their friend for all time. And so now you get basically the rumors of Haji Wilhelm supposedly has converted to Islam. Now, he never did, of course, and the Germans never literally claimed that he did. But they kind of allowed the rumors to go around. The Kaiser was a Muslim or something. And see, part of the reason they were able to get away with this is because, in most of Asiatic, the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim provinces, the Arab provinces, people hadn't really heard of the Germans. They knew about the French, because the French had for centuries kind of intervened and so on. Lately, they had heard about the British. Obviously, the British are kind of everywhere, and they're in Egypt. But a lot of people hadn't really heard of the Germans. And so it's kind of like, the Germans, well, they're sort of like those other Frankish people, but they actually like Muslims. And anyway, so that's the new shtick. The Kaiser has decided to be the great champion of the Islamic world, the great champion of the Ottoman Empire, Abdul Hamid's best friend. So they actually signed the Baghdad Railway Convention. It's true that the Germans, they never really had enough money to finance the whole thing themselves, but it was basically a German project to build the Baghdad Demiryolu, as you call it, the Baghdad Railway Convention. There were some secret clauses, which I'm quite fond of, that had to do with the Germans had all these excavation rights, for archaeological artifacts and that sort of thing. But the key part was the Kaiser actually enjoined to spy for Abdul Hamid. Because by this point, in part because of the failed uprising of 1896, there are not only a lot of Armenian groups like the Hunchaks and the Dashnaks who have these exiled branches in Europe, but the Young Turks do as well. The Committee of Union and Progress, as we call it in English. Let's see if I can get it right. The Itihat Veteraki Cemiyeti. Did I have it right? Right. The Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks, so-called in common parlance, they have these kind of exile committees in places like Geneva and Paris. The Kaiser promises that the massive German intelligence apparatus will spy on the Young Turks for the Sultan, and that they do. So they have a kind of a quid pro quo. They've got a deal. Right up to 1908, the German-Turkish relationship gets kind of closer and closer. And this is in part because of the larger developments in diplomacy. Although it has mostly to do with colonial questions in Africa, the English and French sign an entente in 1904. You remember the English and French had been like age-old enemies going back to the 100 Years' War. It's not that they fully trust one another. And in fact, although there were clauses for military collaboration, at least on the staff level, they were never revealed to the public. In fact, they weren't even revealed to the cabinet. Right up to 1914, most members of the British cabinet did not actually know that Britain and France had contingency plans to support each other in the case of war. Britain was always kind of a bit arrogant and aloof. They didn't really do alliances per se, but they had an entente, a kind of agreement with France. And then the other one, which was even less of an alliance, but which was still significant, was the Anglo-Russian Accord of 1907. This was mostly to do with Persia, although also other parts of Asia, including Afghanistan, Tibet, essentially kind of spheres of influence. Persia was divided into 3 zones. Basically, the Russians were supposed to have a kind of zone of influence in the north, the British in the south, basically along the Persian Gulf into the Indian Ocean, because after all, they wanted to control the sea routes. Also, there was oil. By this point, British Petroleum had been founded, and there were oil deposits, mostly in the kind of the Gulf region, right down near what is now kind of like Basra and Kuwait, but over on the Persian side. The Karun River region, Abadan. So the British, they've got oil interests, they have kind of communications interests. The middle zone, including Tehran, the capital, was supposed to be neutral. Obviously, they didn't ask the Persians about this. It was just kind of an agreement between London and Petersburg. Now the thing is, it would be a big exaggeration to say that there was an Anglo-French-Russian alliance already. The English and Russians didn't really trust each other. They too had been kind of almost enemies going back, if you remember, 100 years, the great game business. And in fact, if it had been up to the British and the Russians in Persia and in India and Asia, they all hated each other, and they didn't really go along with this. This was rather a decision made in London because the British were increasingly concerned about the German threat strategically. Also because the Germans were now building a deep water navy, which was really, really stupid. That was like the dumbest thing the Germans ever did. They literally did it such that they're building all of these battleships in the Baltic Sea. And they built them such that they had enough coal only to go a couple of 100 miles. In other words, so that all that they could do was go and attack the British. And then they told the British, oh, this isn't actually directed at you. It was incredibly stupid. They wasted lots of money on it. They got nothing from it. In fact, most of those battleships just stood in harbor during the whole First World War until in 1918 they told these sailors, let's go do something. Let's go commit suicide against the British. Die a glorious death. Naturally, the sailors didn't see it that way. They mutinied, and that brought down the German Empire. But anyway, so the naval buildup in Germany alarms the English, so the English decide they need to have some kind of an agreement with the Russians. Also, the French are pushing for this, because the French, remember, are very close to the Russians now. They kind of have an agreement with the English. And so it becomes this key objective of French diplomacy to bring the English and Russians together to the extent that's possible. Again, as I've said, it wasn't really like you had a tripartite entente yet by any military sense. They were not formal alliances. However, they were public, and so people were now worried. The Germans were feeling like they were surrounded, and of course the Ottoman Empire was feeling like it desperately needed allies. Particularly because remember, like a big part of Ottoman diplomacy in the 19th century was using one power against the other, and it was mostly a matter of using like Britain against Russia, right? Or vice versa. It was mostly a matter of having British fears of Russia mean that the British Navy would come in and intervene, as they did in 1878. Now that's probably not possible. Britain and Russia are starting to work together. And so the years between this, like 1906 to about 1908, were in some ways the peak of the German-Turkish alliance. I should have mentioned also that part of the background, particularly to the Anglo-Russian Accord, remember how I talked about how the liberals of Gladstone tended to be pro-Russian and anti-Turkish? Well, the liberals won a huge landslide election in 1905. You should remember this because right up into, and then for the first part of the First World War, it is the liberals who were in power in Britain. That's very important because had the Tories been in power in 1914, or even really 1907, probably Britain would not have gone to war in basically alliance with the Russians. The Tories had always been very wary, if not hostile, to Russia. The Liberals, though, are in power from 1905 to 1914. The new government, the key figures are Asquith, he's the Prime Minister, Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Minister. Eventually, actually, Churchill becomes important. He'll be the First Lord of the Admiralty. For now, though, just remember Grey's name, because he's the Foreign Minister, and we'll encounter his name again and again. Okay, so back to the kind of diplomatic situation then. You know, you're having a closer relationship now between England and Russia. The Turks are worried, the Germans are worried, so they sign a new and almost pseudo-final Baghdad Railway Convention in 1908, actually in June of 1908, to kind of speed up construction on the railway. The Germans by this point, they've got railway engineers all over the Toros Mountains, the Amanus Mountains. It looks like, things, this is actually when they built Haydar Pasha, incidentally. It was finished in 1908. Things are looking good for the kind of, the Abdul Hamid Kaiser Wilhelm II partnership. And then, of course, it all goes up in smoke with the Young Turk Revolution. Now, background of the Young Turk Revolution briefly. I don't think do you call it devrim in Turkish textbooks? Do you call it revolution? Devrim, you do, okay. Because, it's the literature on it, it's a bit confusing. I mean, on the one hand, you have these exile groups in Europe, and many of them are very, very liberal. On the other hand, you have the officer societies in Macedonia, which are in some ways really the real authors of the revolution, because it was, after all, it was the army. It was the army in Macedonia that brought it about. On the other hand, how much of a revolution was it exactly? You remember how I told about how the Constitution gave the Sultan the right to dissolve Parliament? So that on the one hand, this revolution is supposedly restoring the Constitution. On the other hand, the Sultan has said all along that, after all, the Constitution was never suspended. All the Sultan really does in practical terms, faced with this mutiny in the army in Macedonia and the threat that the army is going to march on the capital, is to call for new elections. That's all that he really did in actual policy terms. And in fact, the better research on what was actually going on in July on the streets where there were major demonstrations and so on, is that they were actually saying, Padashim çok yaşa. So, yeah, so there you, did I pronounce it wrong? Padashim çok yaşa, right? Close enough. Well, anyway, so long live the Sultan, right? It's kind of an anti-Abdul Hamid revolt, but kind of not. It's sort of a restoration of the Constitution, but sort of not. There are a lot of different ways of interpreting it. Because another thing, if you looked at the Constitution of 1876 very closely, it actually spoke of a restoration of Sharia law. Because in some ways, it was a reaction to the Tanzimat era of excessive liberalism. So that a lot of people saw the restoration of the Constitution as a conservative thing, particularly your typical imam. So that this is part of the background, to what will become eventually, you know it as the 31 Mart vakası. The 13 April 1909, I suppose you might call it a counter-revolution, followed by a counter-counter-revolution, that is when the Young Turks seized power again. But meanwhile, part of the thing about the Young Turk Revolution is that it disrupted European diplomacy. And it disrupted particularly Ottoman diplomacy. Initially, like a lot of revolutions, there's sort of this initial euphoria, everyone's together, the Sultan's on our side, new elections, the Young Turks are in power, religious equality, women's rights, all the rest of it. Everyone's talking about all these things. But then, because of the distraction or the weakness, you get these events. The Tsar, as he calls himself actually, Tsar Ferdinand. This is when he declares himself a czar. Now, this is Bulgaria. The background is supposedly Abdul Hamid, had invited in, various, ambassadors and so on, but he didn't invite the Bulgarian. The idea being Bulgaria is not an independent country. Now, part of Bulgaria was independent, part was not. And this was taken as a calculated insult by the Bulgarians or something. And so he just declared himself, I am now the Tsar of Bulgaria. In other words, Bulgaria, including Eastern Rumeli, is fully independent. It's like a great big, screw you to the Ottomans. And then the Austrians decide, hey, well, if Bulgaria is going to be fully independent, well, then we're going to take over Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, again, it's semantics. Austria already controls Bosnia-Herzegovina, but they have not declared it a part of Austria-Hungary. So now they do. On top of this, you also had the island of Crete, which declares in I guess the Greek term is eunosis, kind of like what happened in Cyprus in 1974. They declare we are now part of Greece. All of this happens in the course of like 2 weeks in October 1908. 3 humiliations for the new regime, which can all be blamed on the Young Turks. And interestingly, all 3 of them specific repudiations of the Berlin Treaty of 1878, which was supposedly, of course, underwritten by the Germans. So the Germans now seem to have, I suppose, disappeared as Ottoman allies. But then in turn, that is in part because, of course, the Kaiser's friend, Abdul Hamid, seems to have been deposed. He hasn't been deposed exactly yet. But that's how it looks to the Germans. It looks like all of their agreements and work with Abdul Hamid have now gone up in smoke, and so they don't back Turkey during these kind of humiliations. All of these humiliations, meanwhile, they also took place during the month of Ramazan, which was even worse, of course, for conservatives. And that was part of the background, to what would become this kind of counter-revolution, where the sources that I've seen have it that they were actually out there shouting not only that they wanted the Sultan, his powers restored and they wanted Sharia law, but they also wanted the Speaker of the Ottoman Parliament, Ahmed Reza. They wanted his head because he was a symbol of the Young Turk regime and all of that. Well, I'm going to pick up with that stuff actually next week because I think that's actually worth a little bit more time than I can give it now. But for now, just the diplomatic fallout of all of this. Because I think we're towards the end of the first hour. The diplomatic fallout of what is sometimes called the First Bosnian Crisis. This is caused, again, first Bulgaria declares independence, and then Austria, so-called annexes Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, the Russians thought, you remember how the Russians and Austrians thought they had a deal before the 1877 war. The Austrians thought the Russians had promised them this. They're trying to, again, keep themselves from going to war because they know that there are all these dangerous issues. The Russian foreign minister Izvolsky and the Austrian foreign minister Aehrenthal. You might want to write down these names because this is significant. They meet at a place called Buchlau, and they agree, supposedly, that The Russians will allow Austria to annex Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the Austrians will support Russia's claim for access for its warships to the straits, to Çanakkale. This is supposed to be a very secret deal. Okay, a couple things happen. One, Ferdinand declares himself the Tsar, which sort of accelerates things and forces the Austrians to show their hands, so to speak, by annexing Bosnia-Herzegovina. Two, the Austrian ambassador to France lets the cat out of the bag. That is, he confesses that they had this secret agreement with the Russians, which is very embarrassing to the Russians because of several reasons. One, it makes Izvolsky look to the Russians like a sellout because he sold out. Remember, Bosnia-Herzegovina, although there are, as we know from the 1990s, there are these kind of Muslim Turkic peoples or converts to Islam. There are, of course, Croats, and there are also Serbs. So the Serbs are supposed to be like Russian clients, right? And so if Russia allows Austria to do this, it's kind of like Russia's selling out its clients, which would be okay if Russia got something in return. But now that Austria publicizes this, none of the other powers want to allow this. And so basically Russia gets nothing out of the deal. The Austrians get what they want. The Russian ambassador Izvolsky is deeply embarrassed. I mean, he's really livid. I mean, this is like, as a diplomat, it's like you just got pantsed. It's like someone pulled your pants down, basically. That's how embarrassed he is. In fact, they have to fire him because it's such a disaster for Russia. And so they actually send him to France as their ambassador. And when Russia declares mobilization in 1914, he actually says, "This is my war," because he's still angry about what happens in 1908, 1909. So this episode is extremely important. It's usually called either the Bosnian crisis of 1908 or the first Bosnian crisis. You should remember the basics. It has to do with Bosnia-Herzegovina. It has to do with this misunderstanding between Austria and Russia. And the way it ends, very interestingly, is that the Russians finally accept the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in March 1909 when Germany threatens war. And Russia, because of its revolution of 1905, which I mentioned the other day, is kind of in no fit state to mobilize or fight, and so the Russians have to go along with it. But they smart and they seethe, they are angry, they are embarrassed and humiliated. And so we should keep all of that in mind as we look at the Balkan Wars to come in 1912, 1913. I think that's a good place to stop. We'll pick up with the Balkan Wars on Tuesday. One brief note, I will send an email about this, but if you do want to stop by the copy shop, I think it should already be there. There are 3 more chapters from Barbara Tuchman. I promise they're shorter than the one on the socialists. They are much shorter. But they're all very good. The writing is exquisite. And she uses small words, which is good, I think. It's not only good poetically, but I think also she's not trying to use fancy words. The language is simple. So I think you should be able to follow it pretty well.